Imagine you're a medical professional stepping into this completely chaotic emergency room. Or maybe, you're a CEO waking up to a massive public relations crisis.
Yeah.
The clock is ticking, the information you have is totally scattered, and every single choice you make feels like this massive risk.
Right, the pressure is just immense.
Exactly. So today we're taking a deep dive into the exact mental machinery that determines whether you will thrive in that kind of chaos or whether you'll just completely freeze.
And we're pulling from this really fascinating article by Herfel. He's an expert from a tactical training company called Velortech. And the core of what we're talking about today centers on a framework that was literally engineered for these muddy, high-stakes situations.
Yeah, it's used by the military, law enforcement, emergency medics.
And, increasingly by top-tier corporate leaders, too.
Yeah.
It's known as the OODA loop.
Right. And the reason we're doing a deep dive into this today is because whether you're managing a crisis at work, navigating some sudden emergency at home, or honestly, just trying to process an overwhelming amount of information on a daily basis, this framework explains the underlying mechanics of human adaptation.
It really does. But we need to clear the air immediately on this.
Okay.
Because most of what people think they know about this concept is just dead wrong.
Yeah, it's totally backwards in pop culture.
Exactly. The corporate and tactical worlds have heavily, heavily diluted the OODA loop over the last few decades. It's frequently pitched as this, aggressive productivity hack.
Totally, like a rigid checklist for simply moving faster than your competition.
Right. People treat it like a slogan. Just move fast, break things, outpace the other guy. But the creator of this framework, Colonel John Boyd, he was a military strategist. He didn't build a self-help tool for middle managers. He built this profound, scientifically backed theory of conflict, adaptation, and human cognitive survival.
Okay, let's unpack this, just so we have the baseline for the listener, right? The basic acronym stands for observe, orient, decide, act.
Yeah, those are the 4 pillars.
And looking at those 4 words, I mean, it is very easy to see why someone would misinterpret it as a linear step-by-step checklist. You do step 1, then you do step 2, step 3, step 4, and boom, you win.
Which is an incredibly dangerous oversimplification. Boyd's actual theory recognized that human beings rely on internal mental models to navigate the world. We build this map in our heads of how things are supposed to work.
Right.
But reality is constantly shifting. The moment reality changes, if your internal mental model doesn't adapt to match it, your performance instantly falls apart. So because of that, the OODA loop isn't a checklist. It's actually a living, nonlinear, continuously flowing adaptive system.
Ah, okay.
It's full of complex feedback loops and what Boyd called implicit guidance and control, where every single stage interacts with the other simultaneously.
Treating human decision-making like a static checklist, it really reminds me of how people approach different genres of video games.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Yeah, like trying to apply a linear 1, 2, 3, 4 process to a high-pressure situation is like playing this massive, dynamic, open-world survival game as if it were a turn-based board game.
Right, like chess.
Exactly, like chess. In chess, you make your move, you take your hand off the piece, and the entire universe of the board just pauses until your opponent moves. Nothing changes while you sit there and think.
But in an open world environment.
Yeah, or in real life. The environment does not wait for your turn. The weather is changing, other characters are moving around, your resources are depleting. If you are just running down a static checklist, well, by the time you reach step 4, you're interacting with a reality that simply doesn't exist anymore.
That is exactly it. The environment pushes back the very moment you interact with it, which alters the board entirely. That is the fundamental truth captured by the actual OODA loop. Decision-making under pressure is never perfectly informed, and it is definitely never finished after a single action. You are constantly having to feed new data into the system, which forces you to update your interpretation of reality in real time.
So rather than looking at this like a list of instructions, we need to look at it as a continuous narrative of how a human brain processes a threat.
Exactly.
So it all starts with the initial sensory intake observe. When a crisis hits, the environment presents us with just an overwhelming amount of raw data. And the temptation is to think that observe just means, opening your eyes and taking it all in.
Right, just soaking up the room.
But in a high-pressure environment, trying to take everything in is a recipe for total paralysis.
Yeah, because the human brain has a strict processing bottleneck. When things go wrong, much of the information in front of you is incomplete. A lot of it is entirely misleading, and honestly, the vast majority of it is completely irrelevant to the immediate problem you have to solve.
So it's not about gathering more information.
No, poor observation in the field rarely happens because someone is literally blind to the situation. It happens because they succumb to sensory overload or they allow themselves to fixate on a single, really loud distraction. Effective observation is an active, highly disciplined process of filtering. You have to identify relevant cues, things like subtle shifts in movement or specific timing, while actively ignoring the noise.
So you filter those initial cues and you capture a handful of relevant data points. But data points alone don't actually tell you what to do. You hit this critical bottleneck where you have to translate those raw cues into a cohesive story about what is actually happening.
Yes.
And according to the Valortech piece, this translation phase, the orient phase, is the absolute center of gravity for the entire process.
What's fascinating here is that orientation is without a doubt the most critical stage, because raw observation without orientation is just meaningless noise. Orientation is where information becomes meaning.
Right.
But the catch, and this is a big one, is that this meaning-making process is entirely subjective. It is shaped by everything that makes you who you are. Your brain takes the raw data and runs it through the gauntlet of your biases, your culture, your specialized training, your current emotional state.
Which totally explains why two people can stand shoulder to shoulder, look at the exact same chaotic event, process the exact same raw visual data, and walk away with two completely different interpretations of what just happened.
Exactly. They aren't seeing different things. They are applying different internal frameworks to the same reality.
Okay.
And if that internal framework is flawed, every single thing that happens downstream is compromised. You can have perfect observation skills, but if your orientation interprets those details through a biased or inaccurate mental model, you are going to make a catastrophic choice.
Okay, so that leads to the decide phase. Now, once you've built that story in your head, you're forced to actually make a choice. And the article describes this decision phase not as finding absolute certainty, but as forming a working hypothesis.
Right, a working hypothesis.
Wait, if a decision is just a working hypothesis, aren't we just talking about reckless guessing under pressure? I mean, if I'm dealing with a life or death emergency, or even just $1 million corporate negotiation, the idea of operating on a working hypothesis sounds a bit terrifying.
Oh, sure.
Like if a surgeon is operating on me, I don't want them forming a hypothesis, I want them to know the answer.
I completely get that. But the discomfort with that idea comes from our societal expectation that professionals operate with perfect information. We
Wow.
crave certainty.
Oh, we do.
But waiting for 100% complete certainty in a highly dynamic, deteriorating situation usually means surrendering the initiative entirely. By the time you are totally certain, it is way too late to act. A working hypothesis in this context is not a blind guess.
Okay, so what is it then?
It's an educated, highly calculated prediction based on expert pattern recognition. Experienced professionals use their training to efficiently match the subtle cues they've observed and oriented against thousands of hours of prior exposure.
Ah, so they aren't building a novel response from scratch every single time.
Exactly. They are chunking information together and essentially saying, based on my orientation of these specific indicators, this particular course of action has the highest probability of success. It is a practical commitment to a direction, proving it's an educated hypothesis, knowing full well that it might need to change.
Which leads right into the final phase act. You impose that calculated choice onto reality. And the crucial takeaway here is that the physical action is simply a test of your hypothesis. It is not the end of the line.
Not at all. The moment you act, the environment changes. Let's go back to the medical example. If a medic administers a specific drug based on their hypothesis of what is causing a patient's crash, that action immediately changes the patient's biological environment.
Right, the vitals shift.
Right. The vitals might stabilize or they might plummet further. That environmental response gives you brand new observations. The medic has to observe those new vitals, orient to what the drug's effect means, decide if they need to pivot to a different treatment, and act again. The loop restarts instantly.
So an action that was brilliant 10 seconds ago might be entirely wrong now.
Because your own action shifted the dynamics of the board.
Okay, so we have this beautifully complex flowing system that relies heavily on our ability to accurately recognize patterns and constantly update our mental models. But human biology fundamentally fights against this complexity when things get intense, doesn't it?
It really does.
If our ability to orient properly is the linchpin of this entire system, what actually happens inside the brain when the pressure spikes and our internal patterns just fail us?
The biological reality of stress is where this theoretical framework meets a really harsh roadblock. The Valortech source dives deep into the neuroscience of cognitive collapse. When a human being is placed under acute, high-stakes stress, the body's survival mechanisms trigger a massive release of adrenaline and cortisol.
The classic fight or flight response.
Exactly. And this biochemical flood is designed to prioritize gross motor skills and raw physical survival. But it actively degrades the higher-order cognitive functions located in the prefrontal cortex, which are the exact functions the OODA loop relies on.
It essentially hijacks the brain's executive control center. The text notes that acute stress severely impairs our working memory, right? Like our ability to hold and manipulate multiple pieces of information at once.
Right. And that impairment of working memory reduces your cognitive flexibility. Under normal conditions, you can detect subtle nuances, you can compare 3 or 4 competing interpretations of a problem, and you can hold conflicting ideas in your mind. But as stress biochemically degrades that capacity, your field of attention violently narrows.
You literally get tunnel vision.
Yeah, you lose the ability to process peripheral information.
Which triggers what the author calls false orientation. If you are under stress and your attention narrows to a single misleading detail, you will inevitably build a flawed story about what is happening.
Yes, and that is terrifying.
It is. And this ties back to that corporate obsession with raw speed we mentioned earlier. Acting fast on a bad interpretation isn't helping. You aren't outmaneuvering the problem, you are simply accelerating your own error.
Accelerating error is one of the most common failure modes in high-pressure environments. Because your cognitive flexibility is impaired, you fall victim to something called premature closure. You commit to a narrative about the situation far too early in the cycle, based on vastly insufficient data.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because a highly relatable, everyday example of premature closure is like getting a slightly vague, unpunctuated text message from a friend or partner.
Oh, everyone has been there.
Right, you read it, and maybe you're already having a stressful day, so you instantly lock onto a specific orientation. Oh, they are mad at me. You've achieved premature closure based on almost zero evidence.
Yeah.
And from that moment forward, every subsequent interaction, every neutral comment they make is forcibly filtered through that false narrative. You trap your own loop. You stop looking for new data to adapt to how they are actually behaving.
That mechanism happens on a micro level constantly, but when you scale that cognitive narrowing up to a severe stress scenario, the results are catastrophic. What you just described leads to what tactical experts call stress collapse.
Stress collapse.
Yeah. The nuanced, continuously updating OODA loop degrades into a crude, rigid reflex. The brain notices one single cue, assigns one rigid meaning to it, and executes one fixed physical response. The individual loses all capacity to adapt.
Wow. So, if stress biologically breaks our working memory and forces this kind of tunnel vision, how do professional organizations actually apply and train this system? I mean, you can't just throw people into stressful chaos and hope they figure it out.
No, absolutely not. That just reinforces bad habits and creates false confidence. The article gives some very specific examples across different industries to illustrate how they actually build this cognitive scaffolding.
Like in law enforcement.
Yeah, take law enforcement or protective ops. Their observe phase isn't just loosely scanning a crowd. It involves hyper-specific filtering. They are trained to track a person's hands, notice changes in distance, or identify abnormal crowd flow.
Right, they know what to look for.
But the critical training happens in how they orient to those specific observations. Say there's a sudden, erratic movement in a crowd. The professional has to orient first. Is this erratic movement caused by genuine panic from an unseen threat? Or is it aggressive intent directed at me?
And those two orientations dictate wildly different physical responses.
Exactly. You see the exact same necessity in the medical field. Observing vitals or skin changes, orienting to what those mean, and acting to test a treatment priority.
Or in cybersecurity. A tech team observes a highly unusual access pattern on a sensitive server at 2 in the morning. They have to orient to that anomaly. Is this just a tired employee who forgot their password? Or is it a malicious escalation by a hacker? If they orient incorrectly and overreact, they might shut down the company's entire global network.
Costing millions.
Right. But if they underreact, the company gets breached.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, how this applies to your own growth, you have to teach orientation as a direct, explicit skill long before you introduce the stress of the environment.
How did he do that?
Through tactical decision games and structured debriefs. These are essentially low-stakes mental simulators. You present a scenario, pause it at the point of maximum ambiguity, and force the trainee to make a choice. But the physical choice isn't really the point. The critical work happens in the debrief, where they have to ask themselves what assumptions they were making.
They have to articulate their internal orientation.
Yes. Only after a trainee has built that robust understanding do instructors begin using progressive stress exposure, dialing up the heat incrementally.
So what does this all mean for the listener who wants to apply this today?
Well, whether you're dealing with data, technology, or physical security, the ultimate goal is disciplined adaptation. It is the ability to continually update your reality faster and more accurately than the problem evolves.
So speed really is just a byproduct of an accurate orientation.
Precisely. It requires accepting that your initial read will often be wrong, and your survival depends on your willingness to discard a bad hypothesis the moment reality proves it false.
Okay, bringing all of this together, this has been an incredible deep dive. The OODA Loop Observe, Orient, Decide, Act is not about raw speed. It is a scientific model of disciplined adaptation. Success in a high-stakes environment comes down to avoiding false orientation and maintaining the cognitive flexibility to continuously update your mental models.
Absolutely.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Think about a recent decision that went wrong in your own life. Were you acting too slowly? Or is it possible that your observe and act phases were perfectly fine, but your orientation, that internal narrative and the assumptions you brought to the table, was fundamentally flawed from the very beginning?
That's a tough question to ask yourself.
It is. But next time you feel the pressure rising, ask yourself, am I adapting to reality or am I just protecting a narrative?
Great point.
Something to really think about. Keep questioning your assumptions, keep updating your reality, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.